Okay, in this screencast I'm going to cover the other reforms of Tsar Alexander II, such as local government, education, military, censorship and economic reform. First thing I'm going to deal with changes in local government. When he came to the throne, there was effectively no elected local government, and he felt that this contributed significantly to inefficiency. Was therefore determined to put this right. Plus, once emancipation happened, the nobles had lost their legal and judicial control over the serfs, so reform of local government was needed. So most local government in the European part of Russia was to be organised into zemstvor. Two different types. You've got the provincial and you've got the district. The members will be chosen by three separate electoral colleges, one for the local landowners, one for the town dwellers, and a third for peasant members of the rural communes. They'd meet annually to decide matters of policy. Their responsibilities would cover public education, public health, local economic development, road building, provisions of services such as water and fire prevention. The nobility tended to dominate, but cooperated effectively with peasant members, and the whole system seemed to work well. One other aspect that was unfair is that local taxation was more favourable to the nobility rather than the peasantry. But the zemstvor, due to its knowledge of the local area, did much to improve local administration. In 1870, a similar elected councils were set up in towns and cities to provide municipal self-government known as dumas. Like the zemstvor, dumas could raise tax and levy labour to support their activities. So similar responsibilities, but they never gained control of the police. So overall, both these local government initiatives were in many ways successful. They did a good job, as there was a natural incentive for these local professionals to look after their own affairs. So they promoted public health and welfare, considerably improving hygiene, literacy, mortality rates, and the environment. However, there was much limitations to their power. They were not established everywhere. Not in Siberia, for example, until 1914, and they had some powers to raise local taxes, but mostly they were dependent on the central government, and many aspects of local government remained with the provisional governments, who were appointed by the Tsar. The zemstvor also provided an avenue for intellectuals to increase their participation in local government, and a place for them to develop an understanding of local issues. It was also a place where peasants could hear the ideas of reformers as well. Westwood, the historian, actually refers to the zemstvor as seedbeds of liberalism. So overall, the zemstvor were a success, but they did not lead to extending the zemstvor system to an elected national assembly. The Tsar was too committed to autocracy and maintaining his own power, so this is one of the frustrations that the natural step was not taken. The Tsar also brought through legal reforms. Before the emancipation, there were many problems with the justice system. Slow, corrupt, trials took place in secret without the accused, witnesses or any legal representation, and the cases were frequently judged by men without legal training. purely on the basis of written evidence that had often been altered by the police. Even before the trial, the accused would be held in prison. It could be for years, not knowing what they were accused of, and if they were a peasant, they were assumed to be guilty before innocent. So Alexander II began work on reform in 1862. He issued a statute, in his word, to establish in Russia courts of justice that are swift, fair, merciful, and equal to all our subjects, to raise the authority of the judiciary and to give it the independence that benefits it. So there were several things done. Salaries high to avoid bribery. Trials would become public. The accused would be granted a defence lawyer who would argue the details of the case with the prosecutor in front of a jury. The jury were chosen from lists of wealthy people using a property qualification drawn up from the Zemsvar. Both sides could call witnesses, the jury would deliver the verdict, and the judge would decide on the sentence for those who were found guilty. Added to that, judges now would be given proper training, and as I said before, their pay would be increased to make them less open to corruption. And once they were appointed by the Tsar, they held their positions for life. So these reforms introduced the theory of equality before the law. Although they were not universal in the villages, they still had a separate court system, the Balost courts, which operated on their own rules. But overall this was a step forward. Didn't always turn out as the authorities wanted. They felt that these courts were often too lenient with terrorists. The example of Vera Zasulik, who attempted to murder the governor of St. Petersburg, is one case that did not turn out the way the authorities wanted it to. But the efficiency of courts rose, as well as the trust in them. Russians flocked to the courts to see justice in action. An independent bar was set up. One of the side effects of this was it now trained people. So they needed trained lawyers and judges. This led to a growth of a body of people trained in the art of persuasion, used to dealing with officials and the law, and generally disposed towards liberal ideas. So such a body required freedom to debate and discuss ideas, and it proved the breeding ground for reformers, some of whom were to become prominent revolutionaries in the future. So when things didn't quite turn out as the authorities wanted, there was an attempt to reverse some of the early reforms, particularly when it came to dealing with revolutionaries. In addition, the police still had extensive powers. The third section, which is the name for really the political police of the time, still could stop, search and arrest people as it wished, punishing the politically or socially undesirable without bringing them to trial. Milutin, General Dmitry Milutin, was the older brother of Nikolai Milutin. Dmitry was the Minister of Defense from 1862, so it was up to him to really deal with the problems or solve the problems that had come to light during the Crimean War. So between 1833 and 55, around 1 million conscripted peasant soldiers actually died owing to a combination of ill health, lack of warm clothing, outdated equipment, and low morale. So Milutin's aim was to particularly close the gap between Russia's inadequate army and the Prussian one, the Prussian highly efficient armed forces, which had been modernised under Bismarck by Albrecht von Roon. In 1863, Milutin started his reform by particularly trying to raise morale by ending some of the extreme forms of corporal punishment, such as flogging and running the gauntlet, which was running through a tunnel of soldiers armed with wooden clubs or whips. And changes were made to military court procedures. A new code of conduct for soldiers and sailors introduced, and courts could no longer punish people by making them serve in the army. He also decreased the military service from 25 to 16 years, but then again later on reduced it further to 10 years. He also established military schools to improve training and discipline, and colleges to train officers. The last of the military colonies where conscripts had been forced to live, isolated from the rest of society, were abandoned. Medical services were also modernised. Although these reforms were deeply unpopular amongst the conservative elements, they were unable to stop him. One reason being the success of Prussia's success in the 1860s, and particularly in the 1870 to 71 Franco-Prussian War, which showed really that his reforms were the right way to go in emulating the Prussian army. So, in 1875, Manifesto and Statute on Universal Military Service led to nobles no longer having exemption from military service, all male subjects being eligible for military service at the age of 20. No longer could the richer class hire substitute conscripts. This was forbidden, and the length of service was actually shortened for the educated. So university graduates only served 6 months. Those with partial secondary education served 3 months, and those with full secondary education 2 years. Those with primary education served 4 years. This was a bit of a concession to the nobility, but also encouraged peasants to send their sons to school. Actually, those with no education were actually taught to read when they were in the army as well. Overall, there's a lot of strong opposition from nobles, merchants, even aristocratic soldiers to this. They particularly objected to being placed on the same level as peasants. Nevertheless, the reforms were approved and took effect from 1875. So, overall, these changes helped bring a new professionalism, a smaller, better trained army, in which promotion depended less on social status than on actual merit. It also reduced government spending on the army from its high level. It was 45% of total expenditure at the start of his reign. And it was to have some success in the Russo-Turkish War of 1878, although that did take longer than expected, and in many ways helped to improve Russia's image or international reputation as well. The Tsar would also be confident that he now had a corps of well-trained soldiers in every province that could be used to maintain civil order at home. However, not all of the reforms brought the improvements that Milutin had hoped for. The officer class remained largely aristocratic and actually retained its old-fashioned values. Its modernisation was extremely limited. Officers still preferred bayonets to rifles because they believed that long-range weapons would encourage cowardice. Russia, despite some notable achievements, did not keep pace with the West in terms of producing rifles, machine guns, artillery, ships, naval equipment or ammunition. And although they were successful in the 1877-78 war, the war against Japan ended in a disastrous defeat in 1904 and 1905. Uh, Alexander Golvanin, Minister for Education, from 1861 to 66, with others, organised a campaign to bring more widespread, more effective and less class-ridden education to Russia. They favoured an education that would create whole men rather than rote learners. They also stressed the importance of humanities as well as science. In 1863, Golvanin introduced the university statute. This measure gave universities greater control over their admissions and staffing, including allowing women to attend courses, though not to take degrees. Universities were permitted to establish their own research programs and teaching syllabus and to discipline their own students. Higher education was seen as a reform was seen as fundamental to Russia's modernization. It raised, which would need experts in both administration and economics. But it did raise problems because it allowed more critical and independent thinkers to emerge through universities. The education reforms led to a huge increase in the number of students going to university, in particular when universities took up the option of offering scholarships. The Secondary Education Statute of 1864 and Elementary Statute of 1865 addressed primary and secondary education. These measures made it easier to open schools as long as certain basic moral and religious principles were upheld. They became much freer and were open to children of all classes and religions. In addition, village schools were no longer controlled by the church. Overall, Alexander's educational reforms led to a rapid growth in the number of schools. In 1856, only 400,000 children attended primary school, but by 1878, over 1 million children were benefiting from primary education. These reforms didn't end when Golvanin was replaced by Tolstoy, who was more of a conservative, who made changes to curriculum designed to prevent the spread of modern knowledge. Tolstoy introduced a new classical curriculum with greater emphasis on the study of Greek, Latin and mathematics. However, Tolstoy was not ever allowed to undo Golvanin's work. In fact, in some areas it was extended. Women's education made great strides. The imperial statute in 1865, universities were set up degree courses for women, and by 1881 there were some 2,000 women studying at university in Russia. So Tolstoy was really appointed, most of all, to keep the changes in check. Tsar did not want revolution. He felt it was his position to maintain his power. But what had happened really is that more change had been thrust upon Russia in 10 years than had taken place in the previous 150. And some of those results were bound to be somewhat unsettling. Cultural reforms also took place under Nicholas I. All books and newspapers had to be submitted to the government for censor. There had also been strict controls over writers, and those who were critical of the regime had been sent to prison camps. Under Alexander II, new settled rules was issued for writers and editors. Daily newspapers no longer had to be submitted for censorship prior for publication, and books and periodicals of 160 pages, and all academic works no longer needed prior approval. For the first time, Russian newspapers were able to discuss both international and domestic affairs. Information and ideas circulated more freely, and some pushed the boundaries. New books published doubled in the first 10 years, then tripled in the remaining years. Censorship was tightened in the last years of Alexander II's rule, largely due to the wave of criticism and attempts on the Tsar's life. Censorship was strict by British standards, but in contrast to what had gone before in Russia, represented a considerable increase in freedom of both ideas and expression. And even when he tightened up later in his reign, it was still not as severe as under Nicholas I. Sorry, there'd certainly been a change in the relationship between publisher and censor to a much more a mood of cooperation rather than repression. Economic growth was essential for Russia's future. Without a strong economic base, it'd be impossible to achieve the military success needed to restore Russia's international status and prestige. The Emancipation Edict provided the groundwork for the development of a money-based economy, but government intervention was still needed to channel investment in the right directions. The appointment of Mikhail von Reutin as Minister of Finance in 1862 signalled this move towards greater state involvement in industry. Reutin has been described as a financial wizard. He managed to reform the treasury, establishing budgeting and auditing procedures for all government departments. He also abolished previous practice of tax farming, whereby private companies bought the right to collect taxes, and established a new system of collecting taxes. And he produced Russia's first comprehensive budget in 1862. He also extended credit facilities and helped set up the State Bank in 1860. These changes helped put the national currency on a firmer footing and gave more opportunities to those who wanted to borrow in order to develop businesses. In addition, he promoted trade by reducing import and export duties. He was particularly interested in expanding the railway network. Russia's first railway was completed in 1837 on a line between St. Petersburg and Moscow was opened in 1851. So Reutin built on this foundation. By the end of Alexander II's reign, there was 14,000 miles of track. During Alexander II's reign, agriculture also enjoyed a boom, less through any direct intervention but because of other reforms such as the serf emancipation and Reutin's financial changes. He reduced tariffs and the reduced tariffs boosted trade, while the availability of credit benefited enterprising landowners as much as new industrialists. Restrictions are also relaxed on where and what Jews could trade. This didn't mean that anti-Semitism went away. The motivation lay, for the most part, not in what was right and just, but in what made economic sense. Up until this point, Jews in Russia had lived under strict rules about what trade they could practice and where they could live. Up to 1855, they were restricted to live in the border regions, what was known as the Pale of Settlement. It was realised that these restrictions meant the Jews could not make a full contribution to the Russian economy. So many of these restrictions were lifted. In 1859, Jewish merchants of the First Guild and all foreign Jews were allowed to live and trade throughout the empire. In 1860, this right was extended to all Jews who had served in certain regiments, and in 1867, all Jews who had been soldiers.